Okay, welcome to the sixth webinar in the Sex, Race and Class series, which started because Rosemary Campbell-Stephens and I were just chatting with each other on LinkedIn and thought some of what we were saying other people might be vaguely interested in. And we've been delighted by the response and by the number of people we've persuaded to come and talk at the webinars. Rosemary is a bit late today because she's speaking somewhere else in Birmingham. I think she's finished by now. She hopes to certainly be here by question time. And just because we knew she might be late, I have got a recording of her, but we'll wait and see if she can come, which I think will be better. So without further ado, I think we need to, so we've got two other speakers, Casa Amin-Ali, who is a teacher in Dubai, John Clawton, who I've just discovered something extraordinary about, but I probably should have guessed it. So I'll tell you, he used to teach quasi-Kwarteng, and you may want to say something about that later, and me, Graham Smith. So I'm now going to ask Kausor to kick off for us. He's the author of A to Z of School Leadership. So Kausor, over to you.
Thank you. Hope you can hear me. Just to clarify, I'm actually a head teacher in Dubai. I'll start by saying, first of all, my name itself, Kausor. Kausor is an Arabic heritage name. It's Kausor. It's actually a lake in paradise. Adapted into Urdu and then anglicized into Kausor in English. I'll say Urdu with the English accent. But as you speak Urdu, you know it's actually Urdu. And that in itself says a lot about language, culture, and identity. And for me, your name is your identity. And I start off with one caveat saying to remain authentic. And I'll come back to this later on in my presentation. Next slide, please. I think I started to extend the narrative of my childhood. My father, my late father, has essentially had 4 nationalities during his lifetime, from British India to East Pakistan, Bangladesh, and British. That's probably common with many who came to that part of the world. I think the diaspora of empire is something that is a legacy that certainly stays with many of us who have made that journey, historically at least, from other parts of what was then the British Empire into what is now England and the United Kingdom. I was born in 1977, third of 4 children. My father worked in the shoe factory as a tanner. I think the biggest challenge was growing up in a multi-diverse community and adapting and coping in what was essentially being housed by the local council in amongst a very white working class town or community. And just a little fact for you that actually the Dr. Martens shoes, which are often worn by the far right adherents, was actually made just literally 5 miles from my childhood house. I think the one thing growing up was always the case for anybody who could relate to this was trying to reconcile all the time our culture, faith, and identity in amongst the wider community and society. The example I give growing up, certainly in our household, there was no halal butchers. So having the halal chicken slaughtered in our home for fortnight was quite a sight, I must say, and quite scary at times to point out to my parents which chicken must be slaughtered next. Next slide, please. I think certainly then moving into the primary school years in the early 1980s, we were, like perhaps many of you who had a similar experience, one of the few BAME households or children of, or the, as Rosemary quite right would say, the Black global majority households in the primary school in England. And the assumptions that were made all the time that stayed with me, certainly in primary school, was we all look the same, we all sound or speak the same. And these presumptions were made even into practice, where people like myself who were by definition EAL learners, or certainly new to English in terms of our learning, English wasn't spoken in the house, certainly amongst my parents and myself, and having remedial classes for what was then the Gujarati speaking communities essentially came from East Africa, from Kenya and Uganda, migrants. And there was maybe 3 or 4 of such students in our school, and I was the only one who clearly wasn't of that heritage. But they put us all together thinking that we'd all be able to learn from each other. And in terms of having a Gujarati teacher, teaching us English, and I was lost both ways, trying to learn English and certainly unable to speak Gujarati whatsoever. But that was the assumption made. So then they further thought I was further behind in my learning and unable to communicate clearly. And actually, it's a case of choosing the right language and access point would have made so much difference. And even in swimming in primary school, the mandatory weekly swimming lessons at the top end of junior school, the quote that staged me to this day as a 45-year-old man, coloured people have heavier bones. And this put doubt in my ability to swim. And we were literally in the shallow end. And by then I was, to use old money, so to speak, 4'10". I remember standing in the shallow end, the water literally going to my waist, unable to swim because the water was literally too shallow, and assuming I couldn't swim anyway because I had heavier bones. And therefore, myself, one of the students from Gujarati heritage, and the boy from African Caribbean heritage, were all three of us just sat there, literally splashing away every Thursday morning, while all our other, would say, white working class friends were swimming away happily in the large pool. Next slide, please. And then rolling on to secondary school, so in the late 80s, early 1990s, my parents' ambition ultimately that we succeed in school against the odds. That education is the one thing that we all have access to, no matter how awful the conditions in school may be, whether it's potential prejudiced views by some teachers, overt racism by students, supported by some of the parents, about not being friendly with certain people because of who they are and their background. There was amongst the crowd, and always is the way, a few great individuals that really helped pave the way. And particularly in my case, with my form tutors, there were other great teachers along the way, which I do acknowledge in my book, but certainly they were really amazing in allowing me to have that daily contact, that daily safety net of coming to school, being in a classroom where actually I am first on the register, having my surname starting with A, and certainly being called out, and that was also quite a sense of pride that I was number one in the register, but actually more importantly, being treated as equals in the classroom. Moving on to university, then it's interesting what I call traveling in different directions. A friend of mine who became a lifelong friend who came from Birmingham stated, I know in Sheffield together studying for our undergraduate degree, and he was saying how it's not very diverse at all, and it's actually quite a white middle class atmosphere. And I was like saying it was so diverse because I met people from literally all around the world, also from all over the country, and I was like, wow, coming from a small market town in the southeast of England, coming to the northern city, I was just like blown away how diverse it was. And then, aside from my racial identity or my cultural identity, the one thing about class, I've referred to very briefly as working class, middle class, something that really stayed with me in terms of understanding a position or an expected position in society. I was fortunate to study at Cambridge for my PhD, and I was very aware of how one was expected to fit in and the norms. And even in education, the vast majority of my colleagues and course friends were actually went on to study in the private sector, the independent sector in the UK, and I was actually one of the few that went to the state sector because of the expectations that people who study in a certain place should go and work in a certain place. So that was quite an interesting, I suppose, almost social norm. So I guess I was, again, challenging much to the surprise of people, especially when I said I was going to be teaching the state school in the north of England and not necessarily in the southeast, which in itself had a bit of a regional prejudice as well, I would say, and bias. Next slide, please. And then teaching, and I think my first experience in Sheffield in those days was the NQT pool, newly qualified teacher pool. You apply to the LEA or the local education authority, and they would then essentially circulate your CV to other schools who wanted NQTs as per the budget, so very centrally managed budgets. So in Sheffield, I was, I remember this day, teacher of mathematics, so in demand, I guess you might say, and there's literally on the day of the interview, another school asked me, please come to us in the afternoon, this is in early 2000s, and if you don't like the school you went to, and then somebody phoned me up on the Sunday night, I won't forget, saying, don't go to that school, I was deputy head there, I'm now head in this school, please come to our school. So it's quite nice for once to be in demand by virtue of qualification, rather than any other perhaps baggage or label or title you have to be on. So it's valid for who you are. However, the school I joined in, I was literally, as I said, one of two workers or teachers or staff, staff, I'd say, who are of a BAME or Black Global Majority or BAME heritage. And the other one, as I said, he was sport work, in fact. We're always mistaken, even our names were mistaken. Yes, both our names started with K, but the fact is how we're mistaken, I would always say, I would never ever call anybody mistakenly by somebody else's name. And the only way I got back at the person who kept making the same mistake was calling her by a name of her colleague, who she particularly didn't like. Then she goes, well, I'm not so-and-so. So, oh, I'm sorry, well, I'm not so-and-so either. And that's the only way to have a tit for tat, Punch and Judy approach towards actually addressing what was clearly ignorant, albeit on a superficial level. But the things I noticed, if you're late for briefing, you're noted. So it's like, oh, you were late for briefing. Actually, it wasn't me. It was so-and-so being mixed up with the other one. Or if he was late, or if I was late, we always be singled out. But other colleagues who were clearly late, we knew that we should joke about it in the staff room. They were never picked up on it. As I said, they were able to blend into the work majority background, just sneak in and not being told that they were late. For me, it was also having to prove yourself more often. I have to prove that, things were perhaps being asked the same question. Have you done these assessments? Have you entered the data? Sometimes I felt, am I being questioned more than others? And it's easy to fall into paranoia, but there's a sense of sincerity that actually, why am I being perhaps asked more that perhaps somebody else wasn't asked? And I think for me, that what was interesting was actually, I said that the social class proved to be the turning point for success. I think being able to relate to the individuals in my actual school community, understand them, which are all essentially white working class community in Hillsborough, in Sheffield, in the northwest of Sheffield, if you know the city. And certainly, I think for them, it was more about the me understanding their social ambitions or their doubts even of success. Can they progress and break through the social glass ceiling and actually be the first child from their household to go to university, for example, as one measure of success, I suppose. But also, more importantly, it's having a sense of value to their education. It wasn't just go to school because you have to go to school. There's a purpose behind it. And when it's reciprocated, them being curious about me. I mean, there's always the question like words like, do you like curry, sir? And I said, actually, I like fish and chips. They were like, really? I said, yeah, why can't I not like fish and chips? And it was that sense. But actually, when I went to the Hajj pilgrimage, and they were just so curious about that. I said, I'm being Muslim, that I don't drink alcohol. Don't drink, sir, ever. Never drunk alcohol, ever. They're curious by that factor. I don't drink, I don't smoke. Going to the pilgrimage, they're very curious about it. They call it the big camp and camping. I think invariably you build that community partnership, that the respect I have for them as a community. And I remember fighting as a staff governor against the advice from the local authority, in fact, to fight for the school not to be closed and the closure of the school, and fighting the community in town hall back in 2007. And I make that point, it was the previous colour of the government who was actually directing the schools to become academies. It's my only political point I've made for the day, but it's very interesting. The trend was turning already then, tide was turning, sorry, and the trend of direction was going that way, such that schools were being directed to go in a different direction of governance and ultimately funding. Next slide, please. And then as it became, I guess, sorry, next slide. Okay, oops, there, one more, too far. Thank you. And then from teaching, I was fortunate, like I said, as I was fighting in town hall, I was then an assistant head teacher, one of the first, actually probably two BAME heritage senior leaders in the city of Sheffield, the diverse city itself. In 2008, there was literally, from my memory, two assistant heads, I think one deputy head, from my memory, of a city with what, 24, 25 secondary schools. And that was in itself a telling picture with about a demographic of Sheffield, I'd say about 24, 25% children of BAME or BGM heritage. I think that for me, my journey in school leadership is certainly that I've learned how to get my first assistant headship, my first promotion. It takes a few great heads and a few deputies. For me, it was a few form tutors that inspired me in school and in my school journey to school leadership. Now as a head teacher here in Dubai, I think it takes a few great heads and deputies to open the way for you. And it shouldn't be down to that. The system should allow progression based on your merits. But certainly takes a few who actually perhaps make that call that actually you value what you're doing and who you are for what you're standing for, your values and everything else, and what you bring to the table, so to speak, rather than perhaps making you, you got shortlisted, you got interviewed, but you weren't appointed. And I had to reassure everybody watching, I've had so many knockbacks in terms of applications, but you never give up. You always keep going, and you always have the same belief that you know you're able to do the job, and you keep going all the way through. I think, like I said, in Sheffield, it's a bit of a novelty, I guess, and certainly in Doncaster, when I became deputy head, I was definitely very much the standout persons. And I guess, ironically, when I went to Bradford as a vice principal, I was amongst a large community of senior leaders of similar heritage. And it's just a stereotype, because Bradford has a larger ethnic community, if it therefore expects to have school leaders of a sort of ethnic minority so-called background. So what I put as a question mark, is it just cities like that? Pull back a little bit. When I was a teacher, I was running some school football clubs, and I won't forget this meeting, in a fixtures meeting with mainly PE teachers. And the school I said I was from, they were like surprised. They thought, oh, we thought you're from another school, which had a more larger, in this case, Asian student population. So they made the assumption that I was from the other school, assuming that I was going from a school with a so-called population to reflect apparently my sort of appearance, and I couldn't have been from this school, which is essentially white working class. But then in authority, not a doubt kicks in, but certainly a sense of reflection, parents' expectation. If I say something, do they check it with another white SLT member and then accept their word at first, record my point, go back to it, and actually I'm not sure, can I ask somebody else? Even staff line management give the same message but different response, or they go above you. And is that because of lack of respect for your authority, but then accept you as an authority figure? And just that question, is it down to literally who you are, or is it more of a wider issue here of what's accepted as an authority figure? For me, though, it's about leading by example. Any mistakes I feel we make from our sort of community are amplified, not just in the media, but I think even in the workplace. I feel they must justify any errors that we make. Others might be just, okay, don't do it again. And, oops, sorry, get back a slide. Sorry, and I think for career progression, I think the old adage that you'd be twice qualified, twice experienced for half the pay, and in a diminished role, question mark. I've faced that certainly in other roles that my successors have certainly been, for example, paid more. I thought, okay, but let's say as experienced as me or as well qualified as me, and I know in the schools that I have left, I thought, well, how did that happen? And they have to be from, dare I say, a different, certainly appearance. This moves me on then to my last slide of why or how I came back writing this book again, essentially. And this will plug to the bottom, ATSchoolleadership.com. And that's my plug. And essentially, it's about nearly 2 decades of working in schools and really got me a chance to really reflect on my journey. I've been very fortunate to have a very interesting journey, as we all have, I guess, but really to articulate this last year in some spare game time to then say, how can I put some advice to a younger me? What would I say to myself if I was first up in senior leadership and school leadership? How would I navigate the politics, the practice, the policies, and ultimately like a mini guide to be read over, once a fortnight in the course of a year, to really help guide you along the way of how to making better choices in terms of being a more effective leader and manager. And that's it for me. Are you on mute, Graham?
Thank you. So that was very good, and it reminded me that my memories of Kettering are limited to the zoo that I believe is no longer there, but we weren't far away in Peterborough. But thank you. That's fascinating, and I hope that our schools have now become more at ease with their multiculturalism and their multilingualism. But we wouldn't be talking here if actually we got to where we need to be. But it's just a reminder that we have made some progress, and we have managed to promote people from those communities who feature in a lot in our webinars. But we'd like you to be a head teacher here. I think that was when we know we've really succeeded. Okay, right, Rosemary's with us, but I'm just going to ask John, because he's next, to speak first, because we have to rearrange the slides. So,
right,
John Claughton, I'm about to introduce when I've got these things in the right place. And actually, I'm going to come out and use your version of the slides because bringing them in has done an odd thing. So if people give me a minute, stop sharing. While John introduces himself, and you may want to repeat the fascinating story he told me just before we started.
No, I thank you very much, Graham. I don't think I do want to take any responsibility for my previous career. If I could explain myself, I'm described as the founder of Wallow, but as you can see, I'm very old. I'm very white and I'm very male, which probably was a good thing when I was a schoolboy in 1975, but it's probably not so good these days. Your title is about change, and I suppose from my point of view, the interesting thing about change is that I've lived in a world of enormous change. I was a schoolboy in Birmingham, and I went to King Edward's School, Birmingham, and I left in 1975. In a school of 800 boys, it was an entirely boys' school, there were 3 boys who were not white. And if there was any multilingualism at all, it would have come from the children of Central European migrants who had fled to Birmingham. So there were Matishtiks, and there were Shretters, and there were Polkstenises and things. So there was the only multilingualism would have been perhaps 12, 15 Central European boys. I then returned some 30 years later to be the head of King Edward's School, Birmingham. In those years, the change was quite remarkable. And actually, if you look at King Edward's School, Birmingham now, instead of there being 3 non-white boys out of a school population of 800 still, then at least 60, if not 70, if not 75% of the boys are from Asian heritage families, and over 50% of the boys would say that they were bilingual, in the sense that they either spoke English and another language at home, or they spoke another language at home. So in those 40, 50 years, the scale of change in Birmingham, and then thereby in the oldest school in Birmingham, has been very striking. And I suppose this Wallow thing, this World of Languages and Languages of the World project, is an attempt for me to, in a sense, pay for my sins in terms of being head of a multicultural school, and not really fully identifying the opportunities and the diversity. So this is really all a great apology. On the first slide, you have 2 exhibits for the prosecution. The first is a picture of a whiteboard, which my son took on his first day as a modern languages teacher at King Edward's School, Aston, one of the children of King Edward's School, Birmingham, and one of the very few inner city selective grammar schools in this country. It's just by the Villa ground. So my son, in his first lesson as a teacher, asked the form in front of him, the Year 7 form in front of him, what languages they spoke at home. And this was the list which he got on his board. It's nice to see the board rubber there for authenticity. And the other question he asked them was, what languages were you taught in primary school? And they named 4 or 5 languages, largely French and Spanish. But there was only one overlap between the list of languages which the kids spoke and the languages which they'd been taught at primary school. And I suppose what the Wallow program is trying to do is to address this extraordinary richness of diversity of our pupils, which too often, as Kausor has explained, has been treated as a negative, that these kids are somehow EAL, therefore backward or something. Last Friday, I went back to my old school to talk about the world of languages and languages of the world, and I asked about 10 or a dozen King Edward's boys in years 10, 11, 12, their experience of primary school languages. Almost all of them said, when asked the question, what do you do at primary school, you said a little French, or a very little French, or occasionally a bit of Spanish. The next question, when you came into Year 7 at King Edward's, where you start learning French from the beginning, I said to them, was it any use? They universally said, no, it was no use at all. And even if it had been any use, it wouldn't have been any use, because you start again all over again anyway. So what's the point? Now, in this room of 10 or 12 boys, there were half a dozen who were bilingual, Arabic, Urdu, French, interestingly, Japanese. And so the next question I asked them was, have you ever talked about your own language, either when you were at primary school or when you have been here at secondary school for 3, 4, 5 years? and they answered that question with no, we've never talked about it. So those are my two exhibits about the reality of the schools we're talking about. And if we go back to Graham's title about time for a change, I suppose what we've been trying to do, I've been trying to do with some former colleagues and some fellow teachers in my retirement, is try to construct a languages program which doesn't try to teach French badly or unsatisfactorily, and then it being no use anyway because we start all over again at secondary school. But could we invent a program which taught kids about the relationship between languages, the importance of languages, and also gave them the chance to talk about their own linguistic and cultural histories? Next slide, please, Graham. So here we have the problem which anybody who teaches in primary schools would identify. And this comes from the British Council Language Trends Report, which every year reports something very, very similar. In the end, we all know the problem, which is it's hard to get high quality language teaching in primary schools. And when they go to secondary school, because the pupils will have done a range of different things, quality, quantity, language, method, every secondary school has to start all over again. And so therefore we have a problem not only in primary schools, but also in the transition to secondary schools. And once again, as a teacher, as a head, I used to teach Year 7 Latin, and some of the pupils in front of me would have done some Latin at the independent, the prep schools roundabout. Some of them would have done nothing. But I decided not to ask anybody the question because by the end of a fortnight, they're all in the same place anyway. Next slide, Graham. And this also is an example of the reality of not only Birmingham, but many cities like Birmingham. The King Edward's Foundation was once upon a time, had one school founded in 1552 by the boy king. But in the late 19th century, King Edward's became almost the first ever multi-academy trust, founding grammar schools across the city, I say in the 1880s. In recent years, the King Edward's Foundation has done even more, and it's taken more schools into its foundation. And one of those schools is what is now called King Edward VI Handsworth Wood Girls Academy. And a year ago, we did some research in the King Edward's Foundation schools about the linguistic experience of those pupils. And this is merely one example of those schools, and the head has very kindly allowed me to share this data. Okay, and as you can see, this is in a northwest of Birmingham. Here we have a school where over 70%, nearly 75% of pupils would declare themselves to be at least bilingual. Some of them would be even more, would be multilingual, according to this data. The number of schools, languages spoken is in the school by these pupils is 36. And then there you can see some of the numbers, which obviously shows the impact of the diaspora from, I think Kausor with the diaspora from Pakistan, the partition diaspora in a kind of way, and the North Indian Pakistan migrations in the dominance of those languages. And I suppose the point is that we've been teaching those kids are being sat down in French lessons or Spanish lessons with no real regard being paid to actually the extraordinary strength which this should be perceived as. But instead, as I say, we're teaching them French and then complaining that nobody wants to do GCSE. But many, many schools around the country, certainly many, many schools in Birmingham would have very, very similar data. Next slide, Graham, please. So here we go. So the Wallow program is an attempt to try to explore how languages, explore languages in many different ways. One of the ways we start off, and this is a program, it's a set of resources which anybody can use, we'll talk about at the end, okay. But what we try to do start with, and this is a boy in a primary school in year 5, I think, in Birmingham. So multilingual me, one of the early lessons, and a chance to get the kids to actually talk about and explore and go back home and talk to their parents and their grandparents about languages. So this is a little boy, okay? My English, but my parents came from Pakistan. My mum is from the Philippines. So you can see the extraordinary range of languages which this boy has experience of. But in the nicest possible way, going back to my first slide, have we ever asked him? And have we ever made him feel proud of the extraordinary history? No, all my family has done for several generations is talk Yorkshire. The biggest break I've only broken out of Yorkshire by moving to Birmingham and losing my Yorkshire accent, whereas my father still fights on with his Yorkshire accent. So my life, my family, my history is unbelievably dull compared with almost every pupil who sits in front of me. And giving the boys a chance to do this and pinning this to the wall and getting them to talk about it has been a matter of absolute delight for the pupils in the room. Next slide, please. So this Wallow program, which, as I say, we've devised in the last 2 or 3 years and is now being taught in a wide range of schools across the country, it's not trying to teach a language. It's trying to teach you about languages in the plural. So we might want to talk, how do languages work? How does grammar work? How do different languages cope with the issues of tense or person? And once again, that can enable pupils to bring their own languages into the class, and therefore it becomes a sharing thing. Curiosity about languages, making them think why French and Italian are similar, why English is like German, why 1 to 10 in Welsh is the same as very similar to 1 to 10 in Punjabi. Making people think about those things and actually enjoying it and finding things out and working out what words mean, as opposed to being dragged through learning the days of the week. As I've said before, we also hope this kind of program will celebrate, allow the pupils to bring their own history, their own lives into the classroom. And also, fourthly, it's a way of showing, whether you're talking about science or history or the empire or colonialism or geography or whatever, how significant language is, and making people think that they can think their way to the way, way words mean what they mean, and making links so that instead of languages being perceived as a sort of peripheral subject because it's not measured in Ofsted, it might even be seen as the very center of the curriculum with its links into everything else that is going on. And the other thing we think is that, the other thing about it is in these lessons, the teachers don't have to know. It's perfectly allowable, perhaps for the first time, for a teacher to say, I don't know, you tell me, or I don't know, why don't we find out together? And it's that dialogue and thought and sharing which we think makes the classroom experience very different from a didactic learning. Next slide. So here we go. So here are 1 or 2 other things, okay. I don't know with the audience, okay. I've always been rather excited by the fact that Punjab means 5 waters, as in Panj, as in Penter in Greek, as in Ab, meaning as in aqua in Latin. And just talking about what the names of countries mean can pass many an hour happily, and every kid can bring in their own story. Luga Baruga, as it is printed out there, is a wonderful lesson where we discuss why on earth English is such a ridiculous language to pronounce. Because, of course, Loughborough has got exactly the same syllables pronounced in completely different ways in the same word. Because the front half of it is loch, meaning lake, and the back end of it is Germanic, as in Edinburgh and Hamburg, etc., etc. Or we can talk in Birmingham about the Boston Celtics as to why the Celtic football team in green and the Celtic language and the Boston Celtics, and why there are so many Irish families in Birmingham. And then on the right, you can talk about Toy Story, and you can prove to kids that actually they can read a different script, a different alphabet, and work out that Tyrannosaurus means king monster, and Tyrannosaurus Rex means king monster king, which seems a bit odd. Next slide. And here's another example, okay, a lesson which we think works really, really well, which is getting the pupils to think about days of the week. It's something very simple. We never do think about why Wednesday, you know, I keep thinking it's Wednesday, or I keep thinking it's Tuesday. What on earth is Wednesday anyway? And the great thing about this program is that I've got only 5 languages there. But of course, we can think about where do some of these words come from. I love midweek, Mittwoch in German, and the Sabbath gets into Italian, but isn't visible in French or German. And we've got the Christian Dimanche, Domenica type stuff. But of course, every pupil in the class can bring their own language. So my table can go in hands with girls. My table could go 36 languages to the right, as each pupil told us about their days of the week and told us why their days of the week are as they are. And you might end up worrying about the planets, and you might end up worrying about why there are 7 days. But it's sure as hell a bit more interesting than learning French badly, if I can put it that way. Next slide. So that is what we've been trying to do in creating a completely different kind of course, which is responding to the reality of the boys and girls who are coming into our schools. Of course, this relates to the issues of migration, with so many pupils coming in from so many different countries. It relates very closely to the work that Graham is doing, because clearly it is making knowing another language a matter of pride and a matter of substance, as opposed to that being perceived as being a negative. So we would hope this course would work alongside work with pupils with EAL. And also, I would hope that if they really enjoyed learning languages and talking about their own language, that we hope that when they went into secondary school, they might enjoy learning specific languages more. They may be more inclined to value and continue to pursue their own heritage languages. So therefore, the whole problem of the pipeline leading into languages would be to an extent solved. And at King Edward's, I spent all of my time saying, you boys who speak Farsi or whatever else it is, it's you who should be the next ambassador in Kabul, because you are already bilingual. Why is the Foreign Office investing money to train people to speak these languages when you lads all go home for tea and talk it? And to that extent, making the boys and girls realize that by being multilingual, they actually have a massive head start over other people like me who only speak Yorkshire, might also encourage their pride, their confidence, and also increase the sense of integration in our communities. So that's Wallow, and in the end, it's hippopotamus, because going back to Flanders and so on, that's what the hippopotamus does with itself. Thank you.
Thanks very much, John. My screen's showing you rather than me, but I hope everyone else can see me. We have wonderfully now been joined by Rosemary. And I've got to ask Rosemary what she can see, because she couldn't see the slides earlier. Rosemary, what can you see now?
All I can see is, hi everybody, Kausor, John, and yeah, I can see Chakia, Bati, Denise. I can see all the participants, Graham,
Yeah,
and also speakers, but I couldn't see John's slides when you were showing. And I tried every sort of option that was open to me. Speaker, gallery, full screen, and I wasn't seeing anything other than variations of who's in this Zoom.
Okay. Right, well, I'm just going to try the sharing again before we start with you. I hope that works better.
Well, I wanted to actually say something.
Oh, go ahead.
Linking on from John and the bit of Kausor's presentation, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Can I do that while you're trying to?
Do that while I'm sorting slides out.
I mean, you know, as the ancestors would have it, and John and I have had this conversation before, and I think it's probably how Graham thought that he would invite John to join Kausor, and myself and him. I too am an old King Edward's girl, just a few years earlier than, not earlier, later than John. And I really wanted to just share my thoughts as I listened to John's brilliant presentation on language, because the reason that I'm late is that I've just been speaking at the Birmingham Headteacher Conference. And so I was a student at King Edward's Rosehill Road Grammar School in the 1970s. So I stayed on to do my A-levels, so I think I would have left in 79, and then went on straight to teacher training at West Hill College in Birmingham, which is the School of Education from the University of Birmingham. And there are a number of things that I want to say about language, and it relates to my own ambivalence with my relationship with the English language, because of my experience at King Edward's and as a trainee teacher in terms of my own language, Patois Creole, and beyond that, just my way of being as a Black student, not being seen as part of the identity that I could bring to either being a student at King Edward's or a trainee teacher at Birmingham University. And so if I use the Birmingham University experience, which I'd shared many a times, and also shared with head teachers just a few moments ago, I had suggested to my Birmingham University lecturer, because my subject is English, you know, I'm a teacher of English. I'd suggested to him that one of the things that I could do in an assignment was to do a comparative study between Wilfred Owen's poetry on the futility of war and Louise Bennett's references to and writings about the futility of war. So I made this suggestion to the lecturer, and what I was told by him, and we had a very, very good relationship, was that there's nobody here who can supervise this, Rosemary. And that would have been back in late 70s, early 80s, when I was training to be a teacher. And all that did was to consolidate the feeling that I got through King Edward's. My experience as a student at King Edward's is that, yes, you can be bright. Yes, you can pass the 11+. Yes, you can be here. But actually, what you bring by way of your cultural identity has no value here. And I think what the message that sends to Black, brown, and other global majority people is that the way to get on and the way to be accepted is to just be as white as you can. And of course, what it said to me, actually, is that it just underlined the limitations of these great schools. So King Edward's couldn't accommodate a Black girl who could speak standard English and also you know, speak in patois. And when I got to Birmingham University, that couldn't be accommodated either. So all that said to me, I think for other Black people, what it says is, well, just leave that aside. That's not part of your professional identity. And I think some of us are so glad to be in those spaces that we're happy to do that. What it said to me straight away was that these are the limitations of these so-called schools of education. The bigger thing that it says is about the neo-colonial role of language, how colonizers used language as a means to set up these false hierarchies of, you know, what knowledge is valuable, what has worth, who has the power, who has anything to contribute, who's in, who's out. And so I loved the example that John gave, you know, him as a former student, now ending up as a head teacher within the King Edward Foundation, and actually challenging that orthodoxy. And the sad thing is that the conference that I left just now, there aren't more people like John sitting in that conference. I'm
a mile away. I wasn't invited.
Well, there you go. There you go.
So Rosemary, if I could just say, I think what you describe is really fascinating, but going back to my point about change.
Yes.
I would say 40 years on, you have to remember that King Edward School is the school not only of Tolkien, but also Enoch Powell.
Yes.
And I used to say at Open Day that if Enoch Powell could have seen King Edward's as it was, he would have been glad that the gutters had not run with blood. And I would say now, interestingly enough, in terms of what you're saying, that the foundation schools, because of their increased diversity with taking schools like Handsworth Girls, but also at King Edward's itself, 90% of the applicants to King Edward's are non-white. 75% of those get in. These days, the majority of the prefects, the majority of heads of school are non-white. My son, you know, and my son, who is, my two sons went through the school, what they would all value most these days is the extraordinary cultural diversity of the school. And I would hope in the 40 years you're talking about that these King Edward schools have slowly, reluctantly, or whatever else it is, but they have learned those lessons. So that I do believe if you were to go into those schools today, whether it be in Handsworth, one of the original 1880s schools, or whether at King Edward's itself, I think you would be mightily cheered up how the schools had changed to reflect the changing nature of the city.
And what I would say to you, John, is yes, I would be mightily cheered up to walk into King Edward's where I saw more students and maybe some teachers even that looked like me. But the curriculum, the assessment, what Ofsted are looking for, to what extent has that change been matched, John, by the demographic? We're in a city.
Well, funnily enough,
it hasn't. Well, apart from what you're doing in terms of Wallow.
I know, but funnily enough, at King Edward's, it has changed because we gave up on A-levels and we took on the International Baccalaureate.
Fabulous. But is Farsi being taught in your school as a mother language?
No,
that's the kind of change.
That's a very interesting question, and that's one of the things. But on the other hand, going back to your point about the great thing about the English course in the International Baccalaureate is the teachers can teach the texts they want to teach. So my son was taught by a white English teacher, but she had done her doctorate on West Indian poetry. So, and you've got to do some global texts. It's required. So therefore, part of my son's English IB at higher level was studying West Indian poetry. So it's not a perfect solution and there remains much to be done. But once again, talking about curriculum, the cowardice of schools in not breaking away from the centuries old. You've also got to ask the question, Rosemary, at 11 plus, is the fact the exam is set in English to a bilingual city in itself a survival of imperial colonialism? I've mentioned this to the new chief executive of the King Edward's Foundation, who is of Indian family origin and an excellent man who's fully aware of these issues. So that's why I wanted you to meet him, because I think, it's a fascinating question. I'll shut up, Rosemary.
No, I think it's great, and I think it's right on cue, because I didn't know about the English baccalaureate and the extent
The international baccalaureate,
international
not the English
baccalaureate.
baccalaureate.
All right, okay, the international baccalaureate and the opportunities that it presented. I suppose I would say I'm thrilled by that. Yeah, that's something that would make me very, very happy. The other thing I would say is that teachers have always had choices. I had choices as a teacher of English as to what I taught. I could still cover the syllabus. I've taught to the highest level in terms of English and still had a very diverse. So people are making choices, John, and I'm glad that the International Baccalaureate then actually amplifies the kind of choices that we need to have. But I think what people don't want to accept. I live in Jamaica, which is a colonized country. We are described as the largest English-speaking island in the Caribbean. Most of the colonized countries across Africa, and those countries where your Farsi speakers would have come from, part of the colonization process is to remove their languages as their international language, and to replace them with languages like English, or for those who are Francophile, etc., etc. That's why I see this language issue as a neo-colonialism, and they will never in this country move to a point where the assessment is done in a language other than English, because part of the whole system is about ensuring that English as a language and whiteness as a system is always the norm and the model against which others are set. And those who, like you, and that's the kind of thing that would attract me back into leadership. You know, people like you who I'd go back into my school and I would be grabbing that international baccalaureate. I would be using your Wallow program, not just to teach about languages, because I think that's really, really important and key. And actually, it's one of the things that I did take away from a Latin, you know, understanding languages and understanding how languages work. But what it could also go into is this whole thing about us challenging the neutrality of knowledge, whether it be languages, maps, dictionaries, whatever we're looking at. Once people get into understanding how languages work and get how to understand the role that language has played in colonizing people, then you begin to say, well, what else is not neutral around here in this schooling process? What are we actually schooling people into? And that has to be part of the debate when the current big national debate about cancel culture and all of that nonsense is there. Students need a way of navigating their way through the current big conversations, I think. And I'd grab that Wallow program. I really hope that you really push it and get some big funder to get it out there.
Rosemary, can I butt in before I ask you to talk about your book? And just say something, because I didn't know about the IB. King Edwards. I wanted to say something which may surprise people, not about the IB, but about the baccalaureate, which is done in France. Now, France, I don't think any of us suggest is a country which has adapted well to the fact that it is now multicultural and multilingual. It is struggling big time. However, it is perfectly possible to do the baccalaureate, so it's something called the OIB, the Option Internationale du Baccalauréat, in a language other than French. Now that happens to have happened because when NATO started, the 4-star generals from around the world said, we're not sending our kids to an expensive international school. They're going to have to go to a local school, and you're going to have to, Mr. de Gaulle, make it all right for them to be there. So that's what happened. So it is currently possible to do English, do language, literature, history, and geography in English, Spanish, Dutch, Chinese, Japanese, a whole host of languages, as long as someone's got that provision in the school and people are encouraged to do it. Yeah. And that will probably surprise people, because can you imagine if we said, okay, we're going to reconfigure A level, you've got to do 5 subjects, and you can do at least 2 of them in a language other than English.
Absolutely.
And there's nothing to stop us doing it. But
there is, and it's called the Department for Education. That's
okay, Rosemary. This is what we want you to talk about. You're lucky you got.
Yeah, look.
I'm just going to let you talk about it.
Okay, not for very long, okay? But it's essentially my book, Educational Leadership and the Global Majority, Decolonising Narratives, is a book that you can get through Amazon. You can also get it through Palgrave Macmillan. It is printed to order though. So sometimes when you go on to sort of buy it, they say it's out of stock or whatever. Just don't be put off by that and just order it. And you can get it as an ebook, but I know a lot of people want the printed book. It's a very small book by book standards. It's what they call a pivot title because it's under 50,000 words. But the idea behind the book and the reason that I wrote the book was that I was just so conscious of the fact that I was a junior elder. I'm 61 years old, and I did not see our narrative. I did not hear our narrative in terms of our contribution, our intellectual thinking, or even our activism in any aspect of British education life. So, I started my career in Birmingham, and, there were many wonderful things that we did here in Birmingham, a lot of it around language as well. The Multicultural Support Service in Birmingham in the 1980s was really actually quite forward thinking around the kind of issues that we're talking about today. But, for me, it did not permeate into the mainstream of what was going on in Birmingham schools. It always sort of sat on the periphery of multicultural education, et cetera, et cetera. And then later on, when I moved down to London and was, a very reluctant Ofsted inspector down there, and also worked in the London Borough of Waltham Forest as a advisor for institutional review and development, there were all kinds of things that we as Black educators did that, again, is not sort of written in the annals of history. And when the great and the good are invited around the table to talk about, innovation within education, we just weren't there. We actually weren't there. And the thing that really pissed me off was the work that we did on the London Challenge Initiative. I mean, the London Challenge Initiative ran from 2003 to 2011. A minimum of £80 million was spent by a Labour administration on raising standards in London schools under the London Challenge Initiative. Right throughout that time, they were recruiting like hell in the Caribbean to get Black teachers into London schools. The boroughs that they focused on in terms of London Challenge, the student demographic was majority Black and global majority. And yet when you read the work that I did, and Graham was a part of, and a fantastic team was a part of, in terms of investing in diversity, which was a leadership program to get more Black and Asian teachers into leadership positions in London schools. that was funded. 3.5 million was put into investing in diversity at University College London. Yet when you look at the evaluations written up by some of my friends, you know, white colleagues, it's not mentioned. So right throughout my 40-year career, whether it be through Saturday schools, the work we did in Birmingham, work we did in Dudley, the big ILIA work that we were involved in, any of that stuff, none of it's written up. And when you look at London Challenge, it's written up as a success, but it's written up as a success because white saviors, you know, were pulled out of retirement to go into London to save London schools. And there is a thread throughout all of these erased narratives. It's the not seeing and the not naming and the not speaking of race. That's the thread. We just talk about London schools like, yeah, okay, London schools. But we won't say the 5 boroughs that we focused on were demographically Black. And we had to get a lot of Black teachers from overseas to raise standards in those schools. And so what the book talks about is the fact that because we are part of the neocolonialism is about minoritizing us, putting our voices on mute, sending messages to us throughout our careers that basically the way that we get on is to be as white as possible in any space and not to see race ourselves or not to raise race ourselves. And so what the book says is that A, we're not ethnic minorities, and part of the reason that we're still having the conversations that I was having 40 years ago as a young teacher, now that I'm a junior elder in Birmingham, is because you've been talking about us as being ethnic minorities forever, and we're not. We're the global majority. We're the global majority. And if we flip the switch that way, then we get to the kind of perspective that John brought as head teacher of a King Edward school, where he looked around and he said, well, actually, these are not ethnic minority students. These are part of the global majority. And, you know, what do they bring to the table? So the book is about acknowledging who we are as global majority, and it's not just a semantic shift. Let's stop calling them ethnic minorities and start calling them global majorities. It's actually a mindset shift. Because if we're the global majority, who's the minority? Who needs to be included in what? What cultural capital actually has value and adds richness to what we're talking about? And so the book is challenging on a number of fronts in terms of talking about the process of racialization and situating it historically into basically a capitalist system that required for us to be minoritized as minorities, wherever we are, whether we're in England or right across the globe. And then it talks about some of the tools of minoritization and dehumanization, language being one. So chapter 3 is about language and the role of language in terms of colonizing people and colonizing the way that we think. If you think about it, as I said to Birmingham people, and they didn't like it today, you know, Birmingham is an internationally known city in terms of being at the center of the Industrial Revolution on planet Earth. Yeah. And the same city that produced the steam engine also produced the gags that were put on my ancestors' mouths to prevent them from speaking Farsi when they were taken from West Africa to Jamaica and to turn them into property. That didn't have to speak at all. It was illegal actually for Africans to learn to read or to go to school. It was illegal. So part of what I'm saying is that deep rooted within our thinking about different groups of people and the hierarchies is right at the bottom of it, some kind of deep eugenicist thinking about hierarchy, who's important, who isn't, and the dehumanizing of whole groups of people. So my book does go into some dark spaces, but then it also goes into the latter chapters into more hopeful spaces. like the territory that John and Graham and Kausor occupy, where it talks about, it demonstrates to people what's possible. Because I taught, for example, and it is situated in Birmingham, although I don't name the school, I talk about how a group of us as female activists just changed the narrative for a school that Birmingham was going to close. And we knew that that school was very, very important to the Black community. And so we said, no, that's not going to happen. And so we embraced not just ideology, but strategy based on years of understanding activism and how it works. And that school is now a thriving school, little school in Birmingham, a thriving school doing fantastic things. So it's about understanding that once we step out of that minority mindset, we have agency. And the agency that we have is like acting as the global majority and saying, no, that it doesn't have to be that way. The other thing that I talk about is cultural competence in one of the chapters, because I actually think that one of the things that's lacking in terms of our education system is a lack of cultural competence, that people are either unwilling or just don't know how to navigate a culturally diverse space where there isn't a hierarchy placed on one culture being better than another. And so cultural competence is moving to that space where culture is valued in terms of what it brings to a diverse space. And so that we don't have to have an either or, you know, either we cancel that, or we don't teach that white poet and we now teach that Black poet, but we can actually have a situation, as was described through the International Baccalaureate or through the French system that Graham described, where you're actually valuing something other than a Francophile or Anglophile perspective on life, because 85% of planet Earth make up, the global majority: African, Asian, Arab, brown, dual heritage, people who are indigenous to the global South and have been routinely described as ethnic minorities, actually make up 85% of planet Earth. And so whilst we have systems, whether it's economic systems, whether it's, and this is the final chapter, whether it's climate change, whether it's agricultural policy that's working on 15% battery life, which is what it is, if all you have as ways of fixing these systems is the old Harvard-esque white models of how we do things, the old economic models, the old education models, they don't fit. So what the book ends on is, for me anyway, a joyous opportunity for the global majority, to understand who we are and what we bring, and to value what we bring. And for everybody on planet Earth, because the bottom line is, although I've yet to see what the new that new international award that is given, and it was done for somebody who, it slipped me now the name of the award. He or she has done some work in terms of DNA and the origins of a man. So that's going to be quite interesting, because I can just see where that shift might possibly go. But as we currently stand, the orthodoxy knows that everybody on planet Earth actually is African. So at the end, our roots are African. That's the cradle of humanity and civilization. And so what we want is to get back to centering humanity. And when I talk about the global majority in the final chapter, and people say, oh, you're being triumphant around people of color being the majority and white people being the minority. I say, actually, really, I'm not really even talking about white people. I'm talking about whiteness, the system. And a global majority mindset is about humanizing that system by centering humanity and perhaps having different lenses to look at things. And the final thing that I'll say, Graham, because I think it would be good if people, you know, if people have got some questions or whatever to just say. The final thing that I would say is that when I was here in March, I was over here in the UK, there was a news item that I was watching in the middle of the day, and it was about Ukraine. And, you know, the journalist focused on two things, basically. He was focusing on the rising cost of oil as a result of Ukraine and what that would mean for utility bills, but also what it would mean for, you know, putting petrol in our cars and all the rest of it. And he was also talking about Ukraine and how the Ukraine situation was impacting on food supplies and getting food supplies across the world. Yes, it was two different things. I'm not really, the oil thing I'd kind of linked with Ukraine, but the food thing I hadn't. And then the guy looked to camera right at the very end and said, and it was a BBC correspondent, and he said, and capitalism has no answer for this. I've never heard a journalist make that kind of analysis at the end of there. You know, there's a thinking now that says the orthodoxies that have taken us thus far no longer work. They no longer work. So where are we going to look for innovation, different ways of thinking, different ways of dealing with the challenges that we now face, whether it be in education or climate change? And so that's what my little book takes on board. And for some people, I think they're very excited by it. And I really am working up the framework so that it becomes something that, you know, 7 steps or whatever, so that people can clearly, you know, see how you could apply this thinking to any given situation. But more than that, it's about just opening up our minds to the fact that there is no such thing as neutral knowledge. We've all, you know, we're all situated in this conversation where whiteness, the system, just kind of operates without any controls over it whatsoever. And we need to bring something different, because otherwise we won't have a planet to be even talking about. So that's what my little book does and says. And I've been having some very, very interesting conversations with all kinds of people around it.
Thanks, Rosemary. It's a book that if we had more time and done it a different way, I also would have pointed out makes you cry as well as think. Cry in a way that's good for you. I can't see any questions in the chat. Is there anybody burning to ask one?
Or just to make an observation, I think.
We've got lots of people just waiting for the recording who signed up. Can I just want to kind of utter a fairly strange thought, really, because I had an interesting conversation with John just before we started, where he confessed to having taught Kwasi Kwarteng, our Chancellor. And what you may not know, Rosemary, is where our Chancellor went to primary school, which is Waltham Forest, where you were an advisor, and I was a member of the Education Committee. I just thought maybe with these connections with him, as he's so keen on unfunded public spending, we should ask him to double the education budget. You know, it does strange things. And as you say, you know, the model's not working.
No. And this is why this kind of superficial discussion about representation is really, really important. Because it's not really about Kwasi or Pretty or the not so pretty, you know, Home Secretary at the moment. It's about what systems and mindsets are they operating in. You know? And so you can have people like, you know, the handsome Kausor and the beautiful Rosemary being there, but what mindset are we operating in? And a lot of these people have worked damn hard to get as close to whiteness as they possibly can. And they wouldn't recognize it, by the way, because whiteness is neutral. White people aren't socialized as racial, and their systems aren't socialized as racial. It's just systems, financial systems. I'm just applying a financial model that says I'm going to cut, you know, the 45%.
That leads us to what Shaka's had to go, put in the chat. She'd have loved to stay for the discussion on neutrality and knowledge systems.
Absolutely, absolutely. There's no such thing. No such thing. I used to take a dictionary, a Bible, and a map of the world, an atlas of the world, into my English lessons to teach about language. And I would say to them, none of these items, the Bible, the dictionary, or the atlas, are subjective pieces of information, but they're presented as such. The cartographer drew this atlas from a point of view. You know, Webster and Collins argued about which words would go in the dictionary, and the ones that they didn't like didn't make it. Does that mean they're not words? And let's not go there with the Bible. You know, they all come from perspective, they all come from points of view, and they're presented as neutral. And that's why we end up with a quasi, you know, God bless him.
Okay, I can't see any questions, and we're getting, I think we're slightly over the end of our time, actually. So can I thank all three of our wonderful speakers, Kausor, John, and Rosemary. Thank you, those of you who've come. And we hope to see you at the next one, which will be sometime next year. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank
you,
you.
everybody. Thank you.